If I'd like to invite Heidi Howard up to the podium. Heidi is a bioethics, a writer in bioethics, is related to many things, but including genetic counselling, genetic practice, and genetic issues generally. She currently is in Uppsala in Sweden. Those of you who know Heidi, how long she's going to be there, we can't possibly guess, because she moves around an awful lot, but she's in Uppsala at the moment. So welcome, Heidi. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you, Chris, for that introduction. Thank you to you who are here now. I'm a bit distracted because it's not counting down, and I'm very, there we go, nervous to be over time. Because those of you who know me know I can talk for a long time. Okay, so I'm going to talk to you about bioethics and genetic counseling, and I'm going to talk to you more about bioethics, obviously, since you know all about genetic counseling already. So mostly bioethics, and then I want to discuss the role of genetic counselors in bioethics. And I know some of you in the room are in bioethics centers, so I invite you to call me out on things that you don't agree with. And since it is Friday morning and it's 9:03, I'm going to tell you my take-home message right away. And you can think about if you agree with me or not throughout the talk. Based on the bioethics projects that I have been involved in the last 10 years, I think that there's definitely a lack of presence of the genetic counselor's voice. So I don't mean that there should be genetic counseling in a bioethics research project. That's not what I'm saying. I'm saying that the bioethics projects that I have worked in that have all dealt with genetics or genomics in one way or another, you know, there was a clinical geneticist, there was a laboratory geneticist, there was a research geneticist, but I don't think there have been genetic counselors. No, definitely there must have been one or two. And in my current network, I of course include genetic counselors, but properly on the projects who get money to do the work, there have definitely been too few in my opinion. And I think that this should change, and hopefully I will give you some ideas, because I know you all have day jobs, so I'm not saying, you know, in your spare time, reach out to your bioethics center. But if you do have some desire to do more ELSI work, and you're looking for money to do that, or you're looking for groups to do that with, as Barbara said yesterday, work as a team, then I hope I will give you some pists, some routes to get to that goal. And I think that, as you have done for the last 2 days, it's a good idea to think of the role of genetic counselors in these changing times. And I'm going to suggest that you consider this with respect to gene editing, and that will come up in a moment. So before I start, I have to say that my disclaimer is that I'm trained as a molecular geneticist. And in the bioethics groups that I have belonged to, and you will see there are many, I'm not considered a bioethicist. I'm considered a scientist. So everything is a bit relative, and I started this journey from the lab to bioethics about 10 years ago. And I started it in Leuven with Pascal Bory, and my first project was on genetic counseling and direct-to-consumer genetic testing. You know, I needed something that I knew, and I reached for the first thing that looked ethics-like to me, which was genetic counseling. And I remember when I was starting the content analysis of websites for companies, I asked Pascal, I said, but don't I need more ethics in here? You know, don't I need a philosophical theory? Do I have to talk about Kant? Do I have to go back? And he said, no, everything in genetic counseling is ethical. So what he meant by that was that so many of the dynamics between the counselor and the patient, the communication, the explanation of risk, all those aspects and many, many more all have ethical aspects. And I think you've probably come to understand this view of genetic counseling, or maybe you've come to see that when we work in ELSI, we do consider a lot of genetic counseling as part of ELSI, and I'll come back to that later. But that was my start, and now 10 years later, I'm starting my own group, and I'm talking about this again. So I like this full circle. So here is partly also explaining where I'm coming from, but partly the methods that are behind my explanation of bioethics. So I got most of my science training at McGill in Canada and at the CRB in Spain. And yes, that is a beach, and yes, that is where I worked. So if you are looking for a group to work with in research, that's an interesting place. But then I got some more ELSI training at McGill within the group of Bartha Knoppers. And then, of course, I went to Leuven. And then I went to the University of Basel in Switzerland. And then I went to INSERM in Toulouse. And the reason for all this traveling, as was alluded to earlier, is because I was really lucky and I won 2 consecutive Marie Curie grants. So for those of you who don't know what these are, they're career development grants given by the European Commission. And I'm not telling you this to gloat, because I do think I was very lucky, but they are very interesting career development grants, and they do support you properly for 2 years to move, even if you have a family. Well, it depends how big that family is, of course, and how many arrangements you have to do. But it's a very interesting grant scheme for those of you who might want to do something a bit different for 2 years. They love interdisciplinarity. You do have to move countries, usually, and they do want to support people who are changing or who are adding to their career path. So it's just one idea. Marie Curie grants, you will find them online. And then finally, I got a real job as an assistant professor, at Radboud University in Nijmegen. And then finally, I ended up in Uppsala. And all of these places, I was in bioethics centers or in a bigger ELSI team. So why am I differentiating them? Because the ELSI team was just focused on genetics and genomics, whereas the bioethics centers were much more, and I will get to that. And in Uppsala, we are much larger. We're a very large bioethics center. This is just part of us, and I put this up to show you that we're happy, normal people, that you should consider us. And we have doctors and lawyers, and I'm considered the scientist. We can discuss that later. Nurses, physiotherapists, health economists, and then the rest, a lot of philosophers. Which is not bad, but indeed, I think it's the daunting, for me anyway, it was daunting to join a group that had so many philosophers and that saw ethics definitely as being a philosophical domain. So as you, of course, know, bioethics comes from ethics. Ethics was in philosophy, in the philosophy field, in philosophy departments, and this has changed hugely in the last 20 years, so that bioethics now, usually in the groups that I've belonged to anyway, we're in the Faculty of Medicine and the Department of Public Health. And why does that matter? Well, because of course it's going to matter on what they want us to study. So if you're in the Faculty of Medicine, they very much like you to study humans. But in fact, bioethics could include, crops, food ethics, environmental ethics, animal ethics, etc. So the scope of the new bioethics is really huge. And although it started with mostly philosophers, theologians, and lawyers doing bioethics, and now it really has moved on to the myriad of expertise that I just spoke about, and we use a lot of different techniques or methods that come from law, sociology, anthropology, philosophy, and so we use a lot of different methods, and I'm not going to talk about methods today, but I really appreciated Barbara Bieseker's presentation yesterday where she showed you the levels of evidence. And bioethics, as any emerging field, because it is really emerging, a lot of universities don't have a bioethics center. There's definitely, not as far as I know, a lot of bioethics departments. So that we are fighting to exist, because they tell us, well, if you're a philosopher, then be in the philosophy department. If you're a sociologist, be in the sociology department, etc. And so we have to keep defending why it matters for us to be together in a group. And most of the reasons for that have to do with our new interdisciplinary or multidisciplinary approaches to problems. So the lawyers who are working on genetics and genomics, they don't just look at the law, they're also looking at ethics. And they're taking different methodologies, which I will get to in a second. So the primary goal, I would say, in a bioethics group, and this does come, of course, from philosophy, is to be normative and to answer the question, what should I do, or what is the best course of action in this case? Often, as it came from clinical or medical ethics, it had to do with some form of ethical dilemma in the clinic between a doctor and a patient. Of course, we've moved from there, but if you think of that as where this came from, then you could see there's usually a time factor. There would be a patient that would need some form of treatment. And so while it's not an emergency per se, and many of my bioethics professors would say that in an emergency there are no ethics, which is totally debatable. Totally debatable, but the point is that you don't ask for informed consent of somebody who's coming in unconscious that you're going to have to resuscitate. That was the point. So coming back to this, the goal is, to be in some way normative, and definitely that is the view of the more conceptual and theoretical bioethics researchers in our group. But I think what is true of all of us is that whatever we're talking about, we try to make it as explicit as possible. So if I'm saying yes, I do think there should be genetic counseling before testing, I will tell you why I think that quite explicitly. And I'm not necessarily saying that, I'm just wanting to continue on Chris's statement from yesterday, and hopefully I'll be able to come back to that in a bit. So we try to be explicit about our statements, and that being explicit in that way does not have to be based on the tools of philosophers, but it should be clear, why you think it's irresponsible or unacceptable, and of course you could go to why it's illegal or why it's not possible, but those last two tend to be about law and science. But we do bring them in. As an ELSI researcher, I will always bring those in. The bioethicists, the non-ELSI bioethicists might not depend so much talking about the science and the law. And of course, we try to make it as explicit as possible our a priori beliefs, and a lot of the times that's just made, you can do that very easily by just stating what stakeholder group you're in. So if I'm working in ELSI, making a statement on genetic counselors without being a genetic counselor, then that already you can situate my comment. Maybe you could say, I'm not going to take it seriously, but already it's making things a little bit more explicit. And that's what we try to do, even though I have to say that in ELSI of genetics and genomics, I publish mostly in science journals where they don't really care about this. They want to know what our answer is, so it is challenging, but we try to do it as much as possible. So I feel like I could not have this presentation without saying ethics and morals, even though I don't like doing this, because I feel that if a philosopher was here, she would not be impressed, but I will do it since I am part of a bioethics group. And I will say that these terms have been defined in a lot of different ways by a lot of different people. I will tell you what I tell my students, which keeps it very, very simple. And other people will disagree with me, but at least this definition I've been able to keep in my head for a long time, and it's true. It's true. So morals, I would say, are views or opinions, or even accepted. They can even become some form of accepted way of being by a person or a group, but it hasn't been made explicit, and it hasn't been necessarily explained through a systematic analysis of why you have that opinion. So, morals. Ethics, on the other hand, and I've chosen the easy path here, ethics as an academic discipline, of course, is the systematic analysis of reasons and justifications for your stance, for your opinion. So this is the easy definition. Okay? Of course, they're very related, and there's a lot of other definitions. And of course, in bioethics, we try to pay attention to this. But as an ELSI researcher, I don't go back to morals a lot. And actually, I don't go back to underlying philosophical or discussions either. I try to deal with very practical issues. So there's a huge range in bioethics. But there are some of my colleagues that will come back to this regularly in all their papers. So I just wanted to make that point, that bioethics is really, really multidisciplinary, and that if you had asked a philosopher to give this talk, it would be a very different talk. So just keep that in mind. We have a lot of different tools to answer the questions, usually of normativity, but more and more it's not just what should I do, it's what are the issues involved, and it's getting more descriptive. So bioethics is not just normative anymore, there's a lot more empirical work, and here's just a little example of the different tools that we have. The philosophers will use philosophical theories. I've just put 3 of the most famous here that you probably already know. This is, the rule of law, consequentialism, which is what we are usually following when we, our healthcare system will usually try to do the greatest good for the greatest amount of people, and by default, a lot of us think this is the right way to make decisions, which is fine, but it's just one way. And then you could also follow virtue ethics, which is what the virtuous person would do. Do not ask me what that virtuous person is, but I know philosophers who can help you there. And of course, the biomedical principles, which I think, my philosopher colleagues would call it philosophy for dummies, but I think it's actually very useful, where you have an issue and you just start thinking about the principles that you think are the most important in this case. So often with patients, we will be thinking about autonomy, beneficence, non-maleficence, and justice. But you could add to that transparency and honesty and accountability, etc. And definitely I use those tools a lot when I think about ELSI in genetics. And of course, at the bottom, I just put overlapping. So all of these overlap. You can use any tool that you want. I tend to use most of the tools at the bottom. And I also, the reason why I do this is because the scientists I work with love this, that I say, so this is what ELSI does. There's nothing much happening, and then we cause a lot of trouble, because that's sometimes, or often, how they view it, because it is more ethics for them. And for them, ethics is an obstacle to doing what they have to do. And I will get back to this in a second. So I think it's clear that I view ELSI as a lot of almost everything that is not technically scientific, and so I would include, genetic counseling as part of that ELSI. When I address the ELSI, or when bioethicists do their research, they will thankfully compartmentalize it. Are they talking about research? Are they talking about practice? And now we have this new translational area that we've had to deal with since things seem to be stuck there for so long. So this is another way of visualizing the way we will address bioethical issues. So to come back to what the scientists think, or those I've had to deal with, when I present to a group of people, often it's scientists, and when I send away my articles to science journals, more and more I'm getting reviews and comments saying, but this is just more ethics. And and we don't need just more ethics. So just recently, on an article that's going to come out in the European Journal of Human Genetics, the reviewers were, I thought, very, very constructive. And one of them was, but why do we need more ethics? Do we really need more ethics? And so, yes, we do need more research in ELSI. I think it's a she. The reviewer said ethics, but I think they meant ELSI. Yes, I do think we need more ELSI research. And ELSI research is not the same thing as an ethics committee or an IRB. It's not at all the same thing. Unfortunately, or fortunately, depending on how you see that. So unfortunately, because yes, there's a huge problem. I don't know about where you live, but I know that in all the places that I've worked, there are problems with IRBs, institutional review boards or ethics committees, whether they be for an institution or national or regional. And unfortunately, a research bioethics center does not have a lot of say in what happens there unless there are some individuals who are on those ethics committees. So we are not the same thing. It's a bit like saying to a mathematician that your accountant is bad. Of course, there's related there. They're both dealing with math, but it's not the same institution or place at all. So I just wanted to make that clear in case it wasn't already. I feel I'm going to have to say it over and over. So this is how I would put together what I've been talking about in a schema. Of course, since we're at a genetic counseling meeting, maybe I should put it this way. I'm happy for anybody to see it differently. I just think there are a lot of overlaps, and I think there's a lot of place for genetic counseling to be part of bioethics projects. And pardon. I'm going to skip it a little bit here. So this is in the last 7 minutes, just to let you know that I do think we need to find the genetic counselor, and I think that's unfortunate. I think the genetic counselor's voice, anyway, should be more prominent, and this is not to be flippant, but it's really to say that it is hard in some of the projects, at least that I've worked in, to find the genetic counselor's voice, and I think it should be there. So for example, in the readability of consent forms, you've already seen a presentation on Wednesday from Dania Veers. She talked to you about part of that research that we're doing in the context of the European Society of Human Genetics. It's a loose project, but it's still a project by the PPC and the Professional Guidelines Committee. And there we're just studying whole genome and whole exome consent forms in the clinic. And part of that was Dania's work. Another part was by Emilia Nimic, a PhD student I work with. She looked at the readability of 36 consent forms, clearly all in English, because we're looking at readability in English. And what you see here is that you would need at least to be at the end of high school or university or grad school to understand some of these forms. So I don't know if this surprises you, but I would like you to let me know during the discussion if it surprises you and if you care. And this is just for light Friday morning reading. I will give you 10 seconds. Right, so not so good. There's 64 words in this sentence, and you need a grad school education to understand it. It's a bit unfair because it's just clearly just poorly written, but you would assume that there would be proofreading in these forms, that this would not happen. So the question here, as I said, does it surprise you? Does it bother you? What is the ideal course of action? So Danya is in our group, and so she has training as a genetic counselor, so that is the voice in our group, but there's a lot of projects where there are no genetic counselors, and I will try to fit that in the next 2 minutes. So if I go to genome editing, which I used to call gene editing until I saw a flyer outside that said I should only use the word genome editing. I'll get back to that later. This is also work done by the PPPC, or with the PPPC, and this is the paper coming out in the next couple of weeks. And if you want to remember what this paper is about, it's about SEED. We talk about the science, we talk about ELSI, and we talk about engagement, education, and dialogue of stakeholders. And why does this matter? This is the paper I had a lot of problems with. Because we put them all on the same level. Ta-da! Let's get all the same amount of money. Let's get all the same amount of importance, not just the science. So I welcome you to read that paper. Mostly it's a paper of questions. We ask a lot of questions. And I think that for genetic counselors, the question there, one of the questions that's valid is there a role for genetic counselors in treatment, in genetic treatment? And where would that genetic counselor be? And even if the genetic counselor is not in the treatment pathway, should the genetic counselor be there somewhere in the engagement of patients? And I know I see some faces. This is good. I wish I could have the whole talk just on this so we can discuss it further. But here's to push those ideas further. There are clinical trials of somatic gene editing in HIV. Okay, genetic counselor, not so much. Beta thalassemia, somatic gene editing for treatment. Should there be a genetic counselor to explain what that means? What it doesn't mean? What about Huntington's? Because now, go to Sangamo, they have preclinical trials to look at somatic gene editing of the Huntington mutation. So should there be a genetic counselor there? I'm just putting this out there. And even if you don't think it should be in the treatment pathway, what about the consent forms for people who are going to be part of somatic gene editing trials? When you do gene editing, you have to sequence the whole genome of the cells to look for off-target events. What happens with that sequence? What happens with the incidental findings of that sequence, et cetera, et cetera? Who explained this to the research participant? Just some open questions. And the reason why I put SEED there is because it's my little acronym that I'm hoping to work on more and more, stakeholder engagement, education, and dialogue. And I do think that given your expertise with patients and with communication and counseling, I was thinking that there was a good role for you to play in that. So quickly, I'm part of a lot of projects. These at least pay the first 40 hours of my work week. And I can tell you that one of them is called Mind the Risk. It's funded by the Swedish Foundation for Humanities and Social Sciences. It's 6 million euros over 6 years, and we do not have, it's on genetic risk information, the whole thing. And there's not one genetic counselor. We do have a sage-femme, which in English would be a midwife, and there's a clinical geneticist, but they're not part of a lot of the project. And one of the philosophers here once, and I'm part of this project, and they're doing good work, but I think they're missing a lot of everything that you talked about yesterday. You know, they're reinventing the wheel. They think that they're finding things, and I have to keep telling them, yeah, genetic counselors knew that 20 years ago. Unfortunately, I don't have enough power to change the whole thing, and it's almost done. I'm going to skip this one because I want to talk more about Siena, which just started this Monday. It is a EU project, stakeholder-informed ethics for new technologies with high socioeconomic and human rights impact. Ugh, that's an EU title, but really what we're doing is we're going to look at the ethics of 3 different areas of technologies: human genomics, human enhancement and artificial intelligence and human-machine interaction. And I am the work package leader for the human genomics and genetics, and I'm dealing with many philosophers again, and I'm trying to let them know that, that we all, the genetics community has already existed for a long time, and we already have a lot of stakeholders. And the good thing about this project, even though the other two work packages seem to forget that patients are involved, because human enhancement, there are no patients there, and artificial intelligence and robotics also are not on the same level as genetics, I would say. What's good about this project is that it's really led by stakeholder input. So I think over 42 months, we were supposed to have 22 meetings, which is ridiculous. We were able to reduce that to about 12 or 15, and there are going to be stakeholder events. So if you want to be a stakeholder, you can be a stakeholder in this project. That doesn't mean that you have to, well, again, in your free time, I know you're very busy, but you can be part of it by just reviewing what we do paper-wise, or you can be invited to a meeting that we have. Of course, we will cover all costs, and we are trying to find good locations that you'd be interested in coming. And so if you want to be a stakeholder, you can send me an email. I can't tell you that you will be invited, but I can tell you that you will be on this list, and that depending on, and you please do put your expertise or what you're interested in, so like that we would know what to invite you to, which meetings we can invite you to, and we will also keep you informed as to what we're doing. So you'll get newsletters, and of course you can opt out of getting the newsletters or being on our list at any other time. So in conclusion, I do think that there is a lack of the genetic counselor's voice in many projects, and I think that bioethics centers today do a lot of work that you are already doing, just in a different way, maybe in a more just in a different way, from a philosophical perspective, from a sociological perspective, and I think it would be made much richer if your voice was involved. And again, I know you have day jobs, but if you have a bioethics center at your university, you can take a look at what they're doing, and maybe you can participate. Maybe there's an easy way for you to participate in some projects that are already ongoing. Otherwise, if you're exploring funding, especially from the EU, you can look at SWAFs, which is Science with and for Society. They are crazy calls, but they're a lot of money, and there's still a lot of good work that can be done with all that money. There's also cost actions, which are not for research, but for networking. And if you go to the cost action website, you can see there are already networks of geneticists working in specific fields, like, there was one for breast cancer, there was one for colon cancer, and they just got all the stakeholders who are interested, and they had one goal, either to, exchange information, or they're really wide open types of calls. So I will end there, and there's 3 minutes.
Questions for Heidi? Where's the microphone? There's...
Right there. Oh no, that was somebody else.
Yeah, did we go to, it's Barb in the middle, I think.
I'm sorry.
And then was there somebody at the back? It's awful, you can't see. Can we give the microphone to Barb there in the middle of the back row of the front section? I think it's Barb. Might not be.
It's hard to see. Or maybe there are no questions.
No, you won't question. Okay, questions? Here, I found a question.
Yeah, exactly. Friday morning, question searching.
Thanks so much. This was a fascinating talk. And I think it speaks a little bit to what we were debating on yesterday. In terms of the counselling, I think as genetic counsellors, we downplay the breadth and depth of our genetic knowledge. And that, I think, is the crux of this, that so many of these scientists don't understand why we can't just run around testing. And I actually still like to hear what you were saying about pre-testing genetic counselling. I absolutely agree that we need it, because we are the people that understand the effects on our patients.
And the families.
And the families.
Mm-hmm.
And that is our role, I think.
Thank you. Thank you. Anybody else? No? Do you want to make a comment?
Go for it, Heidi. Your talk, not mine.
No, I know. I'm just thinking if I want to address comments or questions. So I don't know if there's a follow-up comment for that there is a role for genetic counseling, and even in gene treatment. Oh, at the back. I know, it's Friday morning. Oh, and 50 seconds, yeah.
Hi, thank you for that talk. I'm Margaret Har from Children's Hospital Philadelphia in USA. And I've been listening, to a lot of the debates, and one of the points you brought up is about counselors sort of in the lab and on the consent side, and I'm one of those non-traditional lab counselors. And I feel like a lot of what I do in the lab is in this realm of bioethics, of responsible product development, responsible advertising, writing consent forms, writing result reports. And so it's sort of that genetic counselor on the front end of consenting, but even taking it a step further back into the lab. And so I think, there's sort of this perception that the lab counselors are more on the technology side, not necessarily the counseling side. But just, I feel like my counseling skills go into a lot of what I'm doing on the lab side in this realm of bioethics, and really thinking a lot about, if a genetic counselor is not the person who's going to be doing the consenting, what do I want the consent form to say? And if it's not a genetic counselor returning the results, what should the result report look like, and what resources should the patient be able to get from that report? So I think there is a role for that, and a lot of what you're talking about, resonates with, I think, the lab counselors as well as the clinical counselors.
Great, thank you so much. So we have to end, and I just want to say that I know that there are not enough genetic counselors, so it's not like I want to take you away from your day jobs again, but maybe to think about your skills being used in other places is not a bad idea for a vision of genetic counselors, especially as more and more are being educated. Thanks again.